In the spring of 1847, somewhere along the fertile plains of South Carolina's tobacco country, a white planter named Edmund Harrove, worth over $100,000 vanished without a trace from his own estate. 3 days later, his body was discovered at the bottom of a dry well on the eastern edge of his property, his neck twisted at an angle that suggested a fall, or something far worse. Within 6 months, his young widow, Catherine Harrove, married the dead man's most trusted servant, a man named Josiah, who had been enslaved his entire life until the very week of Edmund's death. By 1869, Josiah owned more land than any black man south of Richmond and died the wealthiest freedman in 3 counties. The authorities never asked a single question, the neighbors never spoke a word, and the truth stayed buried for over 60 years until a forgotten journal surfaced in a crumbling courthouse basement, written in a hand that belonged to someone who knew exactly what happened that spring night in 1847. Before we continue with the story of Josiah and the Harrove fortune, if you're fascinated by dark mysteries rooted in America's hidden past, make sure to subscribe to and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this. Leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We love hearing from our community around the world. What the journal revealed wasn't just a story of one man's rise from bondage to unimaginable wealth. It was a meticulous chronicle of manipulation, calculated patience, and a crime so perfectly executed that it became invisible in plain sight. The Harrove plantation sprawled across nearly 800 acres of rich Carolina soil, positioned along the PD River, where the land rolled gently toward the water, and the air hung thick with humidity even in early spring. Edmund Harrove had inherited the estate from his father in 1841. A man in his late 30s with a reputation for shrewdness in business and a certain coldness in personal affairs, he was not well liked among his neighbors, too calculating, too removed from the social graces expected of a gentleman planter. But he was undeniably successful. His tobacco fetched premium prices in Charleston, and his wealth was the subject of both admiration and quiet resentment throughout the county. The Harrove household consisted of Edmund, his considerably younger wife Catherine, whom he had married only 2 years prior, and a staff of 14 enslaved people who maintained the house, fields, and stables. Among them was Josiah, a man whose exact age was difficult to determine but who appeared to be in his early 40s. Josiah had been purchased by Edmund's father decades earlier and had grown up on the estate, learning to read and write in secret, a dangerous and illegal skill for an enslaved person in South Carolina, where laws explicitly forbade such education. But Josiah was careful, exceptionally so, and his intelligence had not gone unnoticed by Edmund, who used him as a personal assistant, trusting him with financial records, correspondence, and even sensitive business transactions that required discretion. Catherine Harrove was 24 years old, the daughter of a declining planter family from the northern part of the state. Her marriage to Edmund had been arranged by her father, desperate to secure her future as his own fortunes crumbled. She was described by those who knew her as quiet, observant, with dark eyes that seemed to absorb everything without revealing her thoughts. The marriage was reportedly unhappy. Edmund treated her more as a decorative fixture than a partner, often leaving her alone for days while he traveled to Charleston or attended business in Columbia. Catherine spent her time reading, tending a small garden behind the main house, and occasionally speaking with Josiah, who was one of the few people on the estate who could hold an intelligent conversation. By early 1847, tensions on the Harrove plantation had begun to simmer beneath the surface. Edmund had grown increasingly paranoid about his finances, obsessively reviewing his ledgers and questioning every expenditure. Some neighbors whispered that he suspected his overseer, a brutal man named Thaddeus Crenshaw, of skimming profits. Others suggested Edmund feared his wife might be planning to leave him, though no one could point to concrete evidence. What was certain was that Edmund had become more isolated, more suspicious, and more dependent on Josiah to manage the details of his daily affairs. Josiah himself was an enigma to most who encountered him. He spoke little, moved with a quiet efficiency that made him nearly invisible in social settings, and possessed an uncanny ability to anticipate his master's needs before they were expressed. Some of the other enslaved people on the estate regarded him with a mixture of respect and weariness. He was neither cruel nor particularly kind, simply distant, as though his mind operated on a plane separate from the daily humiliations and hardships of their shared condition. If Josiah harbored any resentment toward his bondage, he never showed it. If he dreamed of freedom, he kept those dreams locked behind a mask of perfect servitude. The spring of 1847 brought unusually heavy rains to South Carolina, turning the roads into rivers of mud and delaying the planting season. Edmund grew increasingly agitated, pacing the veranda of the main house and snapping at anyone who approached him. On the evening of May 3rd, he summoned Josiah to his study and closed the door. What transpired in that room would never be fully known, but when Josiah emerged nearly an hour later, his expression was unreadable, his movements as calm and measured as always. That night, Edmund told his wife he would be inspecting the eastern fields at first light and retired to his bedroom alone, a habit he had adopted in recent months, preferring solitude to Catherine's company. Catherine, for her part, spent the evening in the parlor, reading by candlelight until nearly midnight before retreating to her own quarters. The next morning, Edmund Harrove did not appear for breakfast. By midday, concern began to ripple through the household. Josiah organized a search of the grounds, methodically directing the other workers to comb through the fields, stables, and outbuildings. It was late afternoon when one of the field hands discovered Edmund's body at the bottom of an old stone well that had been abandoned years earlier, after a newer one was dug closer to the main house. The well was located in a remote corner of the property, surrounded by dense underbrush and rarely visited by anyone. Edmund's neck was broken, his body crumpled at the bottom of the shaft in a position that suggested he had fallen head first. His hat was found several feet from the well's opening, as though it had been blown off by the wind. There were no signs of a struggle, no visible wounds beyond those consistent with a fatal fall. The local constable, a man named Robert Finch, was summoned from town and conducted a cursory investigation. He concluded that Edmund had likely been inspecting the property in the early morning darkness, stumbled near the concealed well opening, and fallen to his death. It was a tragic accident, Finch declared, and nothing more. The funeral was held 4 days later, attended by a modest crowd of neighbors and business associates, who offered their condolences to the young widow before departing as quickly as propriety allowed. Catherine Harrove stood beside the grave in a black dress that seemed to swallow her small frame, her face pale but composed, her eyes dry. Josiah stood at a respectful distance, head bowed, perfectly still. Within a week of Edmund's burial, Catherine summoned a lawyer from Charleston and began the process of settling her late husband's estate. To the shock of nearly everyone in the county, Edmund's will, witnessed and notarized just 3 weeks before his death, contained a provision that immediately freed Josiah from bondage and bequeathed him $500 in cash along with a small parcel of land on the western edge of the plantation. The will stated that Josiah had served the Harrove family with unparalleled loyalty and intelligence and deserved to be rewarded for his service, The neighbors whispered, of course. Some suggested Edmund had grown sentimental in his final days. Others wondered if Catherine had influenced her husband to include the provision, though no one could explain why she would do such a thing. A few more suspicious minds questioned the timing. Why had Edmund drafted this particular version of his will so close to his death? But these questions were asked quietly over dinner tables and in parlors, never directly to Catherine or Josiah. In a society built on rigid hierarchies and unspoken rules, openly challenging the validity of a white man's will was simply not done, especially when that white man was dead and his widow was still mourning. Josiah accepted his freedom and his inheritance with the same quiet composure he had displayed throughout his years of servitude. He moved into a modest cabin on his new land and, for the first several months, lived a solitary existence, tending a small crop and rarely venturing into town. Catherine, meanwhile, remained at the main house, managing the plantation with surprising competence for someone who had previously shown little interest in its operations. Then, in November of 1847, exactly 6 months after Edmund's death, Catherine and Josiah were married in a private ceremony conducted by a traveling minister in the parlor of the Harrove house. There were no guests, no celebration, no announcement in the local papers. The marriage simply happened, and by the time the neighbors learned of it, the deed was done. The scandal was immediate and explosive. A white woman marrying a formerly enslaved black man was not merely socially unacceptable in South Carolina in 1847. It was illegal under state law, punishable by fines, imprisonment, and social annihilation. And yet Catherine Harrove defied every expectation, every rule, every threat of consequence. When confronted by a delegation of outraged neighbors, she calmly explained that she and Josiah had discovered a loophole in the law. The marriage had been performed by a minister from Massachusetts, where such unions were legal, and the ceremony had technically taken place on property that Catherine owned outright, which she argued constituted a kind of private jurisdiction beyond the reach of local statutes. It was a legal argument so audacious, so carefully constructed, that it left the authorities momentarily paralyzed. While state officials debated whether to prosecute, Catherine and Josiah simply carried on, living together openly, managing the plantation as partners, and gradually expanding their holdings by purchasing adjacent land from struggling neighbors. By the time the legal system finally moved to challenge the marriage, nearly 2 years had passed, and the couple had already transferred much of their wealth into complicated trusts and partnerships that made it difficult to seize their assets without triggering a lengthy court battle. The authorities, realizing they were dealing with adversaries far more sophisticated than they had anticipated, quietly dropped the matter. But the true darkness of the Harrove story did not lie in the scandal of the marriage. It lay in what had happened on the night of May 3, 1847, in the hours before Edmund Harrove's body was discovered at the bottom of that abandoned well. The journal that surfaced in 1909, found by a courthouse clerk clearing out a storage room that had been untouched for decades, was written in Josiah's hand. It was not a confession in any legal sense, but rather a meticulous record of events, written with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized Josiah's entire life. The journal entries began in March of 1847 and continued sporadically until December of that same year, after which they abruptly stopped. The earliest entries described a conversation between Josiah and Catherine that had taken place in the garden behind the main house on a warm afternoon in late March. According to Josiah's account, Catherine had confided in him that Edmund had become increasingly violent, striking her during arguments and threatening to sell several of the enslaved workers, including Josiah himself, if she did not comply with his demands. She was terrified, trapped in a marriage to a man who viewed her as property, with no legal recourse and no family willing to intervene. Josiah wrote that he had listened without responding, but that evening, alone in his cabin, he had begun to think. Edmund Harrove was worth over $100,000. Under South Carolina law, if Edmund died without children, his entire estate would pass to Catherine as his widow, and if Catherine were to remarry, her new husband would legally control that fortune. The possibilities were staggering and utterly impossible under the racial and legal structures of the time, unless those structures could be manipulated. The journal entries over the following weeks detailed a plan so intricate, so dependent on precise timing and psychological manipulation, that it read less like a crime and more like a piece of elaborate clockwork. Josiah noted Edmund's growing paranoia about his finances and began subtly feeding that paranoia, mentioning in passing that he had seen the overseer, Thaddeus Crenshaw, meeting with a merchant from Charleston under suspicious circumstances. He planted ledgers with minor discrepancies, just enough to make Edmund question whether he was being cheated. He suggested, always respectfully, that Edmund might want to inspect the more remote sections of the property personally, without Crenshaw's knowledge, to ensure everything was in order. On April 20th, Josiah wrote that Edmund had asked him to draft a new will, one that would cut Crenshaw out of any potential inheritance and include a provision freeing Josiah as a reward for his loyalty. Josiah had carefully guided Edmund's thinking, suggesting language that would protect Catherine while also ensuring Josiah's own freedom and a modest inheritance. Edmund, increasingly isolated and suspicious of everyone except Josiah, had agreed to every suggestion. The entries from early May were sparse but chilling in their precision. On May 2nd, Josiah noted that he had spent the afternoon clearing brush near the old abandoned well, ostensibly as part of general property maintenance. He had removed the rotted wooden cover that had once protected the well opening and left the area in a state that appeared natural, overgrown, but with a narrow path that someone walking in dim light might follow without realizing the danger ahead. On the evening of May 3rd, after his private meeting with Edmund in the study, Josiah wrote a single sentence: "He will inspect the eastern fields at dawn, as I suggested he should." The journal contained no explicit confession of murder. There was no description of violence, no admission of pushing Edmund into the well. What it contained instead was something far more damning, evidence of premeditation, of psychological manipulation so skillful that Edmund Harrove had walked to his own death, believing it was his own idea to inspect that remote corner of his property in the darkness before sunrise. The entry dated May 4th, written after Edmund's body had been discovered, was brief. The constable suspects nothing. Catherine performed her role without error. The will has been validated. We are free. If this story is making you question everything you thought you knew about history, hit that like button and share this video with someone who appreciates dark, complex mysteries. Stick with us because what happened next proved that Josiah's plan was only the beginning of a much larger transformation. In the immediate aftermath of Edmund's death and Josiah's subsequent freedom, the Harrove plantation entered a period of strange, suspended normalcy. Catherine assumed control of the estate's operations with a competence that surprised many but raised suspicions among those inclined to see conspiracy in every shadow. She proved to be a capable manager, maintaining the plantation's productivity and even negotiating better prices for the tobacco crop than Edmund had achieved in his final years. Josiah, now a free man, began building a reputation as a skilled agricultural consultant, advising other freedmen and even some white farmers on crop rotation and land management techniques. The marriage in November sent shockwaves through the community that never fully dissipated. While the legal challenges eventually faded, the social isolation of Catherine and Josiah was absolute and permanent. They were not invited to church socials, not acknowledged on the streets of town, not included in any of the networks of mutual support that characterized plantation society. They existed in a kind of parallel world, visible but untouchable, prosperous but completely ostracized. What made their situation even more remarkable was that they appeared entirely unbothered by this isolation. While other social outcasts might have withered under such sustained rejection, Catherine and Josiah seemed to thrive. They expanded their landholdings steadily throughout the 1850s, purchasing properties from families devastated by failed crops or crushing debts. They diversified their investments, moving money into railroad bonds, textile mills, and urban real estate in Charleston. By 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, they controlled over 2,000 acres and had an estimated net worth exceeding $200,000, making Josiah one of the wealthiest black men in the entire South. The war years were catastrophic for most Southern planters, but Catherine and Josiah navigated the chaos with the same calculated precision that had characterized their rise. They quietly sold their tobacco holdings before Sherman's march, converted their assets into gold and Northern securities, and spent the war years in relative safety. Emerging in 1865 with their fortune not only intact but substantially increased, they purchased entire estates for fractions of their pre-war value while their neighbors struggled to rebuild from devastation. Reconstruction brought new opportunities and new dangers. The political upheaval, the sudden enfranchisement of freedmen, and the violent resistance of white supremacist groups created an environment where someone like Josiah, a wealthy black man married to a white woman, should have been a primary target for violence. And yet, year after year, Josiah and Catherine remained untouched. Their property was never burned, their lives never directly threatened, their business dealings never seriously disrupted. This immunity puzzled many observers. Some attributed it to Josiah's careful cultivation of powerful allies, both black and white. Others suggested that Catherine's white skin provided a shield that Josiah used strategically. A few whispered that the couple had dirt on enough prominent citizens, secrets about wartime profiteering, evidence of covert Northern sympathies, documentation of financial crimes, that an attack on them would trigger revelations no one wanted exposed. But there was another explanation, one that appeared in Josiah's journal and suggested a darker, more systematic approach to maintaining power. Beginning in 1850 and continuing through the war years, Josiah had kept detailed records of conversations, transactions, and behaviors of nearly everyone in his social and business orbit. He documented who was having affairs, who was embezzling from their own families, who had sold goods to Union forces during the war while publicly supporting the Confederacy, who had failed to pay taxes, who had falsified property records, who had committed fraud in their business dealings. The journal was not just a record, it was an insurance policy. Josiah had created a network of vulnerability, a web of documented secrets that made him simultaneously too dangerous to attack and too useful to completely exclude. When violence threatened, Josiah would have quiet conversations with specific individuals, mentioning particular facts or events in passing, and the threats would mysteriously evaporate. When business deals fell through, Josiah would send carefully worded letters to relevant parties, and suddenly doors would reopen. It was blackmail, but blackmail so subtle, so carefully calibrated, that it was barely recognizable as such. Catherine, according to the journal, was a full partner in this strategy. She maintained correspondence with women throughout the region, ostensibly for social purposes, but these letters served as intelligence, gathering operations. She attended church services at a small, racially integrated congregation on the edge of town, where she cultivated relationships with people from every social class. She donated to charities and causes that gave her access to financial records and personal information. Together, she and Josiah constructed a surveillance apparatus that would have impressed any modern intelligence agency. By the late 1860s, Josiah's wealth and influence had reached levels that seemed impossible for someone who had been enslaved just 20 years earlier. He owned property in 3 counties, held shares in multiple businesses, served on the board of a freedman's bank, and was consulted by Republican politicians seeking to understand the complex dynamics of Reconstruction era South Carolina. And yet, for all his public success, Josiah remained fundamentally unknowable. He gave no interviews, published no memoirs, made no grand speeches about his journey from bondage to fortune. He simply existed, accumulating wealth and power with relentless efficiency, while Catherine stood beside him, equally silent, equally enigmatic. The first serious challenge to Josiah's carefully constructed empire came in 1868, when a young attorney named Samuel Garrett arrived in South Carolina from Pennsylvania. Hired by distant relatives of Edmund Hargrove to investigate the circumstances of Edmund's death and the subsequent transfer of his estate, Garrett was in his late 20s, idealistic and ambitious, believing he had uncovered evidence of a massive fraud that would make his reputation as a lawyer. Garrett's initial investigation focused on the will that Edmund had drafted just weeks before his death. He obtained copies of earlier versions of Edmund's will from the Charleston law firm that had handled the Hargrove family's legal affairs for decades and discovered significant discrepancies. The earlier wills had made no mention of freeing Josiah or providing him with any inheritance. The final will, drafted in April 1847, was radically different, and the witnesses who had signed it were both dead, one from cholera in 1849, and the other from injuries sustained during the war. Garrett next turned his attention to the circumstances of Edmund's death itself. He interviewed the retired constable Robert Finch, who was now in his 70s and suffering from failing memory, but recalled that the investigation had been brief, perhaps too brief. Finch mentioned that he had accepted Josiah's account of the timeline, that Edmund had left the house before dawn to inspect the eastern fields, but admitted he had never actually verified that Edmund had been seen leaving or that there were any witnesses to his departure. Armed with these preliminary findings, Garrett approached Catherine and Josiah directly, requesting an interview. They received him cordially at the main house, which had been substantially renovated and expanded in the intervening years, and listened patiently as he explained his concerns. When he finished, Josiah asked a single question, "Do you have any evidence that Edmund Hargrove's death was anything other than an accident?" Garrett admitted he did not yet, but believed such evidence could be found with a thorough investigation. Josiah nodded thoughtfully, then suggested that Garrett might want to speak with several other individuals who had known Edmund well, including a retired judge named Horatio Pendleton and a banker named Charles Wickham. He provided addresses and even offered to write letters of introduction. Garrett spent the next 3 weeks conducting interviews and reviewing documents. Slowly, a picture began to emerge, but it was not the picture he had expected. Every person he spoke to confirmed the same narrative. Edmund Hargrove had been paranoid, unstable, increasingly erratic in his final months. The judge mentioned that Edmund had come to him seeking advice about dissolving his marriage, claiming Catherine was plotting against him. The banker revealed that Edmund had withdrawn large sums of cash in the weeks before his death, behavior consistent with someone planning to flee or hide assets. A former business partner described Edmund as consumed by suspicions that had no basis in reality. What Garrett did not realize, because Josiah's journal would not be discovered for another 40 years, was that every one of these witnesses had been carefully coached. Some had been reminded of indiscretions from their past that Josiah happened to know about. Others had been offered favorable business terms or timely loans. A few were simply friends who trusted Josiah's version of events without question. The portrait of Edmund as a disturbed, paranoid man who might well have wandered into danger through his own recklessness was not entirely false. Edmund had indeed been paranoid in his final months, but it had been deliberately cultivated and amplified. Garrett's investigation stalled. He could find no evidence of foul play, no witnesses willing to contradict the official account, no documents that proved anything beyond the fact that Josiah had benefited enormously from Edmund's death. Frustrated, he returned to Pennsylvania empty-handed, his reputation damaged by the expensive and fruitless investigation. But Garrett's inquiries had rattled something loose. In late 1868, a series of anonymous letters began circulating in the county, addressed to various prominent citizens and local newspapers. The letters claimed to be from someone who had worked on the Hargrove plantation in the 1840s and who had witnessed suspicious conversations between Josiah and Catherine in the weeks before Edmund's death. The letters suggested that the two had been planning Edmund's murder, that they had manipulated him into drafting a new will, and that they had orchestrated his death to appear accidental. The letters created a sensation. Public meetings were held, demands for a new investigation were voiced, and pressure mounted on local authorities to take action. But there was a problem. The letters contained no specific, verifiable information. They offered no names of other witnesses, no details that could be independently confirmed, no physical evidence that could be examined. They were accusations without substance, sensational but ultimately hollow. Catherine and Josiah responded to the controversy by doing something unexpected. They hired their own investigators to determine the source of the letters and publicly offered a substantial reward for information leading to the identification of the author. This aggressive countermove put the letter writer on the defensive and shifted the narrative. Instead of Catherine and Josiah being the suspects under investigation, they became the victims of a malicious campaign of slander. Within 2 months, the letter writer was identified as a former overseer who had been fired from a neighboring plantation for theft and who bore a grudge against wealthy freedmen in general. The man was arrested, tried for criminal libel, and sentenced to 6 months in jail. The scandal evaporated as quickly as it had emerged, and Catherine and Josiah's reputation, such as it was, survived intact. What the public did not know was that the overseer had been carefully selected as a scapegoat. Josiah's journal entries from this period revealed that the letters had actually been written by Josiah himself, part of a preemptive strategy to neutralize any lingering suspicions by allowing them to be aired and then systematically debunked. The overseer had been framed, his poverty and desperation exploited to provide a convenient villain. It was a ruthless calculation, executed with the same cold precision that had characterized every other aspect of Josiah's rise. The 1870s brought both triumph and shadow to the Hargrove estate. Josiah's wealth continued to grow, and he became an influential figure in Republican politics during Reconstruction, though he never held office himself. He funded schools for freedmen, contributed to churches, and presented himself publicly as a self-made man who had risen through intelligence and hard work, a living embodiment of what emancipation could achieve. But privately, the relationship between Catherine and Josiah had begun to fray. The journal entries from this period, fewer and more cryptic than earlier ones, hint at growing tensions. Catherine had become increasingly interested in spiritualism and reform movements, attending seances and corresponding with abolitionists and women's rights advocates in the North. Josiah viewed these activities as dangerous distractions, potential threats to the carefully constructed facade they had maintained for over 2 decades. In 1873, Catherine suffered a miscarriage, their first and only pregnancy. She was 48 years old, and the loss devastated her in ways that Josiah seemed unable or unwilling to comprehend. She withdrew into herself, spending long hours alone in the garden or locked in her room, writing letters that she never sent. The few journal entries from this period describe Catherine as increasingly unreliable and prone to emotional outbursts that threaten our position. In January of 1874, a stranger arrived at the Hargrove estate, a man in his early 30s who introduced himself as Daniel Stokes, a journalist from Boston writing a book about successful freedmen in the post-war South. He requested an interview with Josiah, and after some initial hesitation, Josiah agreed. The interview took place in Josiah's study, with Catherine present, and lasted several hours. Stokes asked probing questions about Josiah's early life, his relationship with Edmund Hargrove, the circumstances of his emancipation, and the growth of his fortune. Josiah answered carefully, providing the public version of events: hard work, good fortune, wise investments, Catherine's support. But Stokes pressed on certain points, particularly the timeline around Edmund's death and the unusual provisions of the will. At one point, Stokes mentioned that he had spoken with Samuel Garrett, the Pennsylvania attorney who had investigated the case years earlier, and that Garrett still harbored doubts about the official narrative. The interview ended cordially, with Josiah offering to provide additional documentation if needed, but after Stokes departed, Josiah immediately dispatched a trusted associate to Boston to learn everything possible about this journalist. What the associate discovered was troubling. Daniel Stokes was not writing a book about successful freedmen. He was investigating unsolved crimes from the antebellum period, specifically cases where enslaved people might have murdered their masters and escaped detection. Josiah's journal entry from this period is one of the longest and most revealing in the entire collection. He wrote that Stokes represented the greatest threat they had faced since Garrett's investigation, because Stokes was motivated not by money or family loyalty, but by ideology, a belief that the truth, whatever it might be, needed to be exposed. Such people, Josiah noted, were far more dangerous than those seeking profit because they could not be bought, threatened, or manipulated in conventional ways. The entry continued with a detailed analysis of potential responses. Josiah considered various strategies: discrediting Stokes, threatening legal action, using political connections to have him expelled from the state. But each approach carried risks. What Josiah needed was a way to make the investigation collapse from within, to give Stokes a reason to abandon his pursuit that had nothing to do with external pressure. The solution Josiah devised was characteristically indirect. Through his network of contacts, he learned that Stokes was deeply in debt, having borrowed money to fund his investigations and travel. Josiah arranged for one of his business partners, a wealthy merchant with no obvious connection to the Hargrove family, to offer Stokes a lucrative position as a private researcher investigating corporate fraud cases for northern industrialists. The salary was generous, the work was respectable, and the offer came with one implicit condition: Stokes would need to abandon his current projects to take the position immediately. Stokes accepted. He returned to Boston in March of 1874 and never published anything about Josiah or the Hargrove estate. The threat simply evaporated, neutralized not through confrontation, but through the strategic application of financial incentive. But Catherine had been deeply shaken by Stokes's visit. According to Josiah's journal, she began asking questions about what would happen if the truth ever emerged, whether they would be prosecuted, whether their fortune would be seized. Josiah tried to reassure her that the truth would never emerge, that too much time had passed, that too many witnesses were dead, that the evidence was too circumstantial. But Catherine was not comforted. She had begun to have nightmares, Josiah wrote, waking in the night screaming about falling into darkness, about Edmund's ghost returning to drag them down into the earth. The tension between them reached a breaking point in the summer of 1875. Catherine announced that she wanted to leave South Carolina to move north, where they might live more freely, where the weight of the past would not press so heavily on every moment of their lives. Josiah refused. Everything he had built was here, he argued, the land, the businesses, the network of relationships and obligations that protected them. To leave would be to abandon their security, to make themselves vulnerable in new ways they could not predict or control. They argued bitterly, and for several weeks barely spoke to each other. Then, on a sweltering August afternoon, Catherine left the main house and walked to the eastern edge of the property, to the site of the old abandoned well where Edmund Hargrove had died 28 years earlier. She stood at the edge of the now partially collapsed shaft, staring down into the darkness, and stayed there for over an hour. One of the workers noticed and informed Josiah, who found her still standing there as the sun began to set. According to his journal, Josiah asked Catherine what she was doing, and she replied that she was keeping him company. When Josiah asked what she meant, Catherine said she could feel Edmund down there, waiting, patient, knowing that eventually they would join him. Josiah wrote that he realized in that moment that Catherine was no longer fully rational, that the years of secrecy and isolation had broken something essential in her mind. That night, Josiah made a decision. He wrote in his journal that Catherine had become a liability, that her instability threatened everything they had built, and that he needed to take measures to ensure our survival. The entry ended with a chilling sentence, she has always been willing to do what was necessary. I pray she remains so until the end. What happened next would not be fully understood until Josiah's journal was discovered decades later, and even then, the full truth remained shrouded in ambiguity and horror. In September of 1875, Catherine Hargrove became seriously ill. The illness began with headaches and nausea, progressed to severe abdominal pain and weakness, and within 3 weeks left her bedridden and barely able to speak. The local physician, Dr. Marcus Brennan, diagnosed her with gastric fever and prescribed rest, bland foods, and medicinal tonics. But Catherine continued to deteriorate, losing weight rapidly, suffering from tremors and episodes of delirium where she would cry out about shadows in her room and voices calling to her from beneath the floor. Josiah hired nurses to care for her around the clock and consulted with specialists from Charleston, but nothing seemed to help. By early October, Catherine was in constant pain, her body wasted, her mind drifting in and out of consciousness. Dr. Brennan privately told Josiah that he believed Catherine was dying, though he could not identify the specific cause, perhaps a tumor, perhaps some internal injury that had gone undetected, perhaps simply the cumulative toll of years of stress and unhappiness. The nurses who attended Catherine during those final weeks would later speak, always cautiously, always years after the fact, of strange behaviors they witnessed. Catherine would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, lucid despite her illness, and ask to be taken to the window facing east toward the abandoned well. She would stare out into the darkness for hours, whispering words the nurses could not quite make out, as though holding a conversation with someone invisible. One nurse, a devout woman named Ruth Denton, reported that she once heard Catherine say clearly, "I know you're waiting, Edmund. I'll bring him to you soon." During the day, when Catherine's fever was at its worst, she would ramble about events from 1847, describing in vivid detail conversations she and Josiah had held in the garden, plans they had made, fears they had shared. At first, the nurses dismissed these ravings as the confused product of a dying mind, but Mrs. Denton began to notice that Catherine's descriptions were remarkably consistent, that she mentioned specific dates, specific words, specific gestures that formed a coherent narrative when pieced together. Mrs. Denton, troubled by what she was hearing, began taking notes in a small diary she kept in her apron pocket. Josiah visited Catherine's sick room twice daily, in the morning and evening, always bringing her meals personally and dismissing the nurses while he fed her. He would sit beside her bed, speaking to her in low tones that the nurses could not hear through the closed door. After these visits, Catherine would often seem more agitated, her tremors worse, her breathing more labored, but she never complained about Josiah's presence. In fact, during her more lucid moments, she seemed to expect his visits, even welcomed them, though her eyes held an expression that Mrs. Denton later described as *resigned, like someone who has accepted a punishment they believe they deserve *. In the third week of October, Catherine's condition took a dramatic turn. She developed a high fever that Dr. Brennan could not break, and her skin took on a strange grayish pallor that the physician had never seen before. Her extremities became cold despite the warmth of the room, and she complained, when she could speak at all, of intense burning sensations in her stomach and throat. Dr. Brennan began to suspect something beyond natural illness, but he could not identify what. The symptoms did not match any disease he knew, and the pattern of deterioration was unlike anything in his medical experience. On the morning of October 18th, Catherine summoned what remained of her strength and asked Mrs. Denton to bring Josiah to her immediately. When Josiah arrived, Catherine dismissed the nurse, insisting on privacy for what she said would be her final conversation with her husband. Mrs. Denton reluctantly withdrew but remained close enough to the door that she could hear raised voices. Catherine's weak but determined, Josiah's low and urgent. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, and when Josiah finally emerged, Mrs. Denton later recalled, his face was like a man who had seen his own grave opened before him. Catherine died the following afternoon, October 19th, 1875, at precisely 3:00. Mrs. Denton was alone with her at the end, as Josiah had stepped out of the room just minutes before. Catherine's final words, according to the nurse's diary, were, "Tell Josiah that Edmund is satisfied now. Tell him we'll all be together soon beneath the ground where we belong." Then she closed her eyes, exhaled slowly, and was gone. The official cause of death was listed as gastric fever complicated by nervous exhaustion. She was buried beside Edmund Hargrove in the small family cemetery on the estate, under a simple marble headstone that bore her name and dates of birth and death with no epitaph. The funeral was attended by very few people. Most of the old families who had known the Hargroves were dead or had moved away, and the new generation of freedmen and carpetbaggers who populated the region had little connection to Catherine's story. Josiah stood beside the grave as the minister spoke, his face expressionless, his hands folded in front of him. If he felt grief or guilt or relief, no one could tell. But Josiah's journal tells a different story, one that would not come to light for 34 years. The entries from August through October of 1875 describe a methodical process of poisoning. Josiah had researched various substances available to him through his business connections, compounds used in agricultural applications, in mining operations, in industrial processes. He had settled on a combination of arsenic trioxide and lead acetate, substances that would produce symptoms consistent with gastric fever, while being virtually undetectable with the medical knowledge and testing methods available in 1875. He had administered the poison gradually, mixing it into Catherine's food and drink in doses carefully calculated to produce a slow, irreversible decline that would appear natural. The journal entries are clinical in their detail, describing dosages, symptoms, adjustments to the treatment when Catherine's body proved more resilient than expected. He noted her weight loss, the progression of her tremors, the timing of her episodes of delirium. He recorded which foods she could still tolerate and which made her violently ill, adjusting his delivery method accordingly. He documented the reactions of Dr. Brennan and the nurses, satisfied that none of them suspected anything beyond natural disease. There is no emotion in these passages for the first several weeks. No expression of regret or justification beyond a single sentence written on September 2nd. Asterisk, she has become a threat to everything we built. This is necessary. I have protected us before and I will protect us again, no matter the cost. Asterisk, but as Catherine's condition worsened and her death became imminent, Josiah's journal entries began to change. He started describing dreams, vivid, disturbing dreams where he would find himself standing at the edge of the old well, looking down into darkness that seemed to pulse and breathe like a living thing. In these dreams, Edmund's voice would call to him from below, not angry or vengeful, but calm, patient, even welcoming. Asterisk, there's room for all of us down here, Josiah. You knew it would end this way. Asterisk, on October 10th, Josiah wrote about waking in the middle of the night to find muddy footprints leading from his bedroom door to his bed. Footprints that matched the boots Edmund had been wearing the night he died. Boots that had been buried with Edmund's body 28 years earlier. Josiah followed the trail of prints back through the house, down the stairs and out the front door, where they continued across the lawn toward the old well site before vanishing into the grass. He convinced himself it had been a dream, a product of stress and lack of sleep, but the next morning found actual mud still clinging to his bedroom floor. On October 15th, just 4 days before Catherine's death, Josiah recorded an incident that clearly terrified him. He had been working in his study late at night when he heard Catherine's voice calling to him from somewhere in the house, but Catherine was in her sick room on the 2nd floor, too weak to leave her bed. He listened carefully and realized the voice was coming from beneath him, from the cellar. Against every instinct, he took a lamp and descended the narrow stairs into the basement, a space he rarely entered, where old furniture and forgotten belongings were stored. The voice led him to the far corner of the cellar, to a spot where the foundation stones met the earth floor. And there, in the lamplight, he saw something that made his hands shake so violently he nearly dropped the lamp. The earth was disturbed, as though something had been digging up from below. A small depression had formed, and in the center of it lay a gold wedding ring, the ring he had watched Edmund slide onto Catherine's finger in 1045, the ring Catherine had continued wearing even after she married Josiah, though she had moved it to her right hand. But Catherine was still wearing that ring. Josiah had seen it on her finger that very evening when he brought her dinner. He raced back upstairs to her sick room and checked. Yes, the ring was there, glinting dully on her wasted hand. He returned to the cellar, lamp held high, and the ring in the disturbed earth was still there, too. 2 identical rings, impossible and undeniable. He pocketed the cellar ring and filled in the depression with his bare hands, packing the earth down firmly, his breath coming in short gasps. The journal entry describing this incident ends with a passage that reveals Josiah's mental state more clearly than anything else he had written. Asterisk, I no longer know if I am the hunter or the hunted. I began this game 28 years ago believing I could control every variable, anticipate every consequence. But there are debts that compound in darkness, and I fear I have been calculating in the wrong currency all along. Catherine will die in 4 days. I know this because I have planned it, measured it, insured it, but I'm beginning to understand that her death will not end this. Nothing will end this. Edmund has been patient, more patient than I ever imagined possible. He has been waiting in that well, in that darkness, growing stronger while I grew wealthy, and now he is ready to collect what I owe him. What makes these entries particularly disturbing is the revelation that Catherine knew what was happening and had known for some time. On October 18th, the day before her death, she had summoned Josiah for that final private conversation, the one Mrs. Denton had overheard through the door. Josiah's journal entry from that night provides the content of what Catherine had said to him during that hour-long confrontation. Catherine had told him that she had realized he was poisoning her in mid-September when she recognized the taste of the compounds in her food. She had helped her father manage his struggling plantation as a young woman and knew the bitter tang of arsenic from its use in tobacco pest control. But instead of accusing him or seeking help, she had continued eating and drinking what he brought her, accepting the poison without resistance. She told Josiah that she had been ready to die since that afternoon in August when she had stood at the edge of the old well and felt Edmund's presence calling to her from below. I have lived with what we did every day for 28 years, Catherine had said, according to Josiah's account. I wake with it, I sleep with it, I see Edmund's face in every shadow and hear his voice in every silence. You think you have been protecting us, protecting our fortune, our position, but there is nothing to protect, Josiah. We are already dead. We died the moment Edmund fell into that darkness. Everything since then has been a ghost's dream, a phantom existence built on rot and blood. You are killing me because you fear I will expose us. But you don't understand. I welcomed exposure. I prayed for it because judgment, even earthly judgment, would have been a relief from this endless pretense. She had continued, her voice growing weaker but more urgent. Edmund was a cruel man, a cold man, a man who treated both of us as property to be used. I do not regret his death. I planned it with you willingly, executed it without hesitation, but I did not understand then what I understand now, that some acts create obligations that transcend law, transcend morality, transcend even death itself. Edmund is in that well, Josiah, but he is not resting, he is waiting, and when I join him, when you have finished this work you began in September, he will be satisfied enough to wait a little longer for you. But not much longer, a few years, perhaps, and then he will come for you, not with violence or vengeance, but with the same patient, inevitable pull that drags all debts to their final reckoning. Josiah had tried to deny that he was poisoning her, tried to maintain the fiction that her illness was natural, but Catherine had laughed, a sound that Josiah described as more terrible than any scream, because it held not bitterness, but genuine amusement at the absurdity of our lies. She had told him to stop pretending, that they were past pretense now, and that she needed him to understand one final truth. I forgive you for this, Josiah. I forgive you for Edmund, for the years of deception, for this poisoning now. Not because what you did was forgivable, but because I am complicit in all of it, and my forgiveness is as worthless as your guilt. But Edmund does not forgive. Edmund will never forgive. And when you join us, not if, but when, we will all three descend together into the darkness we have earned. The conversation had ended with Catherine asking Josiah to finish the work quickly, to increase the dosage so that her suffering would end within a day. Josiah had agreed, though he wrote that he felt as though he was signing my own death warrant with every word . That night, he prepared a final, massive dose of the poison and brought it to her the next morning in a cup of broth. She had drunk it without hesitation, maintaining eye contact with him the entire time, and had died 7 hours later. The journal entry from the night of October 19th, the night of Catherine's death and burial, is one of the longest and most anguished in the entire collection. Josiah described standing alone in his study after the funeral, surrounded by the evidence of his success, the deeds to thousands of acres, the stock certificates, the bank statements, the ledgers showing assets that made him one of the wealthiest men in the region. He had accomplished everything he had set out to achieve 30 years earlier when he had begun his patient, methodical manipulation of Edmund Hargrove. He had risen from slavery to wealth, from powerlessness to influence, from invisibility to prominence. He had defeated every obstacle, outmaneuvered every threat, survived every challenge. And yet, he wrote, "I feel as though I have spent 3 decades climbing a mountain, only to discover upon reaching the summit that I have been descending into a chasm all along. The height I thought I had achieved is merely the depth to which I have fallen. I am wealthy, but I am alone. I am successful, but I am terrified. I am free, but I am trapped. And Edmund, poor dead Edmund, is the one who has won after all, because he is at rest in his grave, while I must continue living with what I have done, must continue pretending that any of this was worth the cost." The entry concluded with a sentence that has puzzled historians and psychologists. "Ever since, she died this afternoon, the physician suspects nothing. I am now the sole owner of everything we took from Edmund Hargrove. I have won, but God help me, I have also lost everything that mattered." In the weeks following Catherine's death, the strange incidents on the estate intensified. Workers reported not just hearing a woman's voice calling from the direction of the old well, but seeing a figure in white standing at the edge of the woods at dusk, a figure that would vanish when approached. Objects in the main house were found moved or disturbed with increasing frequency. Josiah's personal belongings would go missing and then reappear in significant locations. His shaving razor left beside the well site, his reading glasses placed on Catherine's grave, his pocket watch found in cellar precisely where the duplicate wedding ring had been. Josiah's sleep became profoundly disturbed. He would wake multiple times each night, sometimes finding himself standing in locations he did not remember, walking to the hallway outside Catherine's old sick room, the front porch facing east toward the well, once even in the cemetery itself, standing between Edmund's and Catherine's grave, with no memory of how he had gotten there. He began sleeping with his door locked and furniture barricaded against it, but still he would wake to find himself elsewhere, as though some force were moving him against his will or without his conscious awareness. In December of 1875, Josiah wrote an entry describing an encounter that shook him more profoundly than anything that had come before. He had been working late in his study reviewing financial documents when he heard footsteps in the hallway outside, slow, deliberate footsteps that he recognized immediately as Catherine's distinctive gait, slightly uneven due to an old ankle injury she had sustained as a child. He sat frozen, listening as the footsteps approached his study door, paused, and then continued past, moving toward the stairs. Every rational part of his mind insisted this was impossible. Catherine was dead, buried, gone. But the sound was unmistakable, and it was accompanied by something else, the faint rustling of skirts, the soft creak of leather shoes, the particular rhythm of Catherine's walk that he had heard thousands of times over nearly 30 years. He opened the door, lamp held high, and found the hallway empty, but the footsteps continued, now descending the stairs, and he followed, drawn by a compulsion he could not resist. The footsteps led him through the silent house, out the front door, across the dew-soaked lawn, and toward the eastern edge of the property, toward the site of the old well where Edmund had died 28 years earlier. Josiah followed, his lamp casting wild shadows, his breath visible in the cold December air. The footsteps remained always just ahead of him, close enough to hear clearly but impossible to catch, leading him inexorably toward the collapsed shaft that marked the place where everything had begun. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the well. Josiah halted several feet away, raising his lamp, peering into the darkness. The well had partially collapsed over the years, filled with debris and earth, but the opening was still visible, a darker shadow within the general darkness of the night. And as Josiah stood there, trying to understand what was happening, he heard something that turned his blood to ice. A man's voice, faint but unmistakable, calling his name from deep within the earth. Josiah, it was Edmund's voice, not angry, not vengeful, but calm, almost conversational, as though Edmund were calling to him from another room rather than from beneath tons of earth and rubble and decades of accumulated decay. Josiah, I know you can hear me. I've been waiting for you to come. Catherine is here now, and we're both waiting. It's time, Josiah. It's been time for years, but I wanted you to understand first, to really understand what you've done, what you've become. Do you understand now? Josiah tried to speak, tried to deny what he was hearing, but his throat had closed and no sound would come. The voice continued, patient and inexorable. You thought you were so clever, planning everything so carefully, manipulating everyone so skillfully. And you were clever, Josiah, far cleverer than I ever was. You took everything from me, my life, my wife, my fortune, and you made it look like accidents and natural causes and legal inheritance. You built an empire on my bones. But cleverness isn't wisdom, and success isn't victory. You forgot the most important thing. Debts must be paid. And the longer they go unpaid, the more interest they accumulate. The voice paused, and in the silence Josiah heard another sound, softer, feminine, unmistakably Catherine's. Come home, Josiah. Come home to us. You've been running for so long, and you must be so tired. We're all tired. Let's rest together now in the darkness where we belong. Josiah fled. He ran back to the house, stumbling over the rough ground, his lamp swinging wildly, his heart hammering in his chest. He burst through the front door and bolted it behind him, then raced upstairs to his bedroom and did the same with that door, piling furniture against it, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the chair backs and table legs he dragged into position. He spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of his room, his loaded pistol in his lap, listening to the silence of the house and praying for dawn. The journal entry describing this incident ends with a question that seems to rise from the deepest part of Josiah's soul. Have I finally crossed a line that cannot be defended by cleverness alone? Have I ventured so far into darkness that I can no longer find my way back to light? Or was I born in that darkness, and have I simply been pretending to be human all these years when I am really something else entirely? Something that belongs in the earth with Edmund and Catherine, something that has no right to walk in daylight or live among decent people. The remaining entries in the journal become increasingly fragmented and disturbing. Josiah describes more encounters with impossible phenomena, shadows that moved independently of their sources, doors that opened themselves despite being locked and barricaded, the persistent smell of decay that would suddenly fill a room and then vanish just as quickly. He writes about seeing faces in mirrors that were not his own, about finding Catherine's handwriting in books he knew she had never touched, about waking to find mud and grave dirt tracked through his bedroom despite the windows and doors being secured. But what disturbs Josiah most profoundly is not these external manifestations, but something internal, a growing conviction that he is no longer entirely himself, that something is slowly hollowing him out from within, making room for other presences. He describes moments when he will be speaking to a visitor or conducting business, and suddenly realize he has no memory of the previous several minutes, as though he had briefly ceased to exist, and then returned to find himself mid-conversation. He describes times when he catches his reflection in a window or mirror, and sees expressions on his face that he did not choose to make, emotions he did not consciously feel. On Christmas Eve 1875, Josiah wrote an entry that suggests he was considering ending his own life. He described standing in his study with his pistol loaded, the barrel cold against his temple, his finger on the trigger, but he could not complete the action. Not because he wanted to live, he was clear that he no longer found any joy or meaning in existence, but because he feared what would come after. If I die by my own hand, he wrote. I will descend immediately to where they are waiting, and I will face their judgment with no more delays, no more distance, no more pretense, and I am not ready. God forgive me, but I am not ready. I am a coward at the last, as I have been a coward throughout, hiding my crimes behind cleverness and rationalization. I will live because I am too frightened to die, and I will die eventually because I am too weak to truly live. Just when we thought we'd uncovered the darkest secrets of Josiah's rise to power, the true horror reveals itself in his complete psychological unraveling. If this story has given you chills, share it with someone who appreciates complex historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support deep dives like this, and subscribe so you never miss these disturbing tales from America's hidden past. Because what happened to Josiah in his final years proves that some debts can never be escaped. Josiah lived for another 8 years after Catherine's death, but they were years marked by increasing isolation and evident psychological deterioration that everyone who encountered him could not help but notice. He withdrew almost completely from public life, stopped attending political meetings, and gradually reduced his business activities to the bare minimum necessary to maintain his properties. Neighbors, who occasionally saw him, described a man who had aged decades in mere years, his once sharp mind apparently clouded by some unnamed burden, his posture stooped as though carrying an invisible weight. He hired and fired a succession of housekeepers and servants, unable to keep anyone in his employ for more than a few months. Those who worked at the estate during this period later spoke, always anonymously, always years after the fact, of a house filled with dread, where strange sounds echoed through the halls at night, and the master would be found wandering the grounds before dawn, seemingly searching for something he could never find. One housekeeper reported hearing Josiah holding conversations in his study late at night, speaking in different voices as though multiple people were present, though when she opened the door, she always found him alone. The few visitors Josiah received during these years all remarked on the dramatic change in his demeanor. Where he had once been reserved but composed, he now seemed perpetually anxious, starting at unexpected sounds, frequently glancing over his shoulder as though being followed. His hands trembled constantly, and he rarely slept, judging by the dark circles beneath his eyes and his haggard appearance. In 1879, in what appeared to be an attempt at atonement, Josiah made a substantial donation to establish a school for black children in the nearest town, with the stipulation that the school be named the Catherine Hargrove Memorial Academy. In 1881, he funded the construction of a new wing at the local hospital, again insisting it be dedicated to Catherine's memory. Later that same year, he endowed a perpetual fund for the maintenance of the cemetery where Edmund, Catherine, and he himself would eventually be buried. These acts of apparent philanthropy puzzled many who had known Josiah during his years of accumulating wealth. He had never been particularly generous while climbing to prosperity. Those who read his journal decades later understood these gestures differently. They were not tributes but expiations, desperate attempts to balance accounts that could never be balanced. In an entry from June 1879, Josiah wrote, Perhaps, if her name is spoken with reverence by enough people, if enough children are educated under her memory, the voices will stop and the shadows will cease their pursuit. But I am simply a fool, believing that money can wash away blood, that buildings can atone for murder. In 1882, Josiah's health took a severe turn. He developed a chronic cough that physicians could not explain, accompanied by chest pains and difficulty breathing. He lost a significant amount of weight, his already thin frame becoming skeletal. His mental state also continued to deteriorate. He began referring to people who were not present, asking visitors if they could see Edmund or Catherine standing in the corner of the room, seeming genuinely confused when told that no one else was there. The final entries in Josiah's journal, written in an increasingly shaky hand, chronicle the complete collapse of his psychological defenses. He wrote about no longer being able to distinguish between waking and sleeping, reality and hallucination, past and present. They are not angry anymore. He wrote in January 1883. They are simply waiting, and their patience is more terrible than any rage could be, because their patience means they are certain of their victory, certain that I will join them eventually. In February, Josiah drafted a letter that would distribute his entire fortune among various charitable institutions after his death. He specified that none of the money should go to any individual heir, and that all organizations receiving funds must publicly acknowledge that the money came from a man seeking to make amends for unpardonable crimes. When his lawyer tried to convince him to reconsider, Josiah refused. I will not live much longer. He told the man. I can feel it. Something is pulling at me, pulling me down into the earth where I should have gone 36 years ago. Josiah died on March 7, 1883, at approximately 3:00 in the morning, the same time of day that Catherine had died, found slumped over his desk in his study. The official cause of death was heart failure. On his desk, beside his body, was a sheet of paper with a single sentence written in Josiah's hand. I am ready now. Take me to where we all belong. The funeral was poorly attended. Josiah was buried in the small cemetery beside Edmund and Catherine, his grave marked with a simple headstone. No one delivered a eulogy. No one spoke of his accomplishments or mourned his passing. He was simply interred and forgotten, as he had requested. The terms of his will were executed without challenge. His entire estate, valued at over $300,000, was divided among several black educational institutions and charitable organizations serving impoverished communities throughout the South. The Hargrove estate itself was sold to investors who subdivided the land. The main house stood empty for several years, acquiring a reputation for being haunted before being torn down in the early 1890s. When Josiah's journal was discovered in 1909, tucked inside a sealed box in a courthouse storage room along with Mrs. Denton's nursing diary, it created a brief sensation. Several newspapers published excerpts, and there was talk of reopening investigations into both Edmund's and Catherine's deaths, but nothing came of it. All the principals were long dead, the evidence was gone, and the legal system had little interest in prosecuting crimes that had occurred more than 60 years earlier. The journal eventually made its way into university archives, where historians debated its authenticity and meaning. Some viewed it as a confession by a man driven mad by guilt. Others saw it as evidence of genuine supernatural phenomena. A few suggested that Josiah's guilt had manifested as psychological hallucinations rather than genuine paranormal events. What seems certain is that Josiah genuinely believed he was being haunted, whether by actual supernatural entities or by manifestations of his own guilt. becomes almost irrelevant in the face of his obvious psychological suffering. The truth about what actually happened on the night of May 3rd, 1847, when Edmund Hargrove died, and during the autumn of 1875, when Catherine wasted away, like so many truths from that dark period of American history, remains ultimately unknowable. Did Josiah murder Edmund by luring him to the well? Did he poison Catherine? Or did his guilt-ridden mind convince him he had committed murders that never actually occurred? The documents suggest possibilities but offer no definitive answers. Perhaps the most significant question is not whether Josiah was guilty in a legal sense, but whether guilt itself, regardless of its objective basis, can function as a form of punishment more terrible than any court could impose. Josiah lived 36 years after Edmund's death, accumulating wealth and power that should have been impossible for a man born into slavery. And yet, if his journal is to be believed, those 36 years were not a triumph but a prolonged torture, a slow descent into psychological hell that no amount of money or status could prevent. In 1951, during construction of a shopping center on the site where the Hargrove plantation had once stood, workers unearthed the remains of the old cemetery. The bodies were supposed to be relocated, but the records of this reburial are incomplete and contradictory. The shopping center operated through the 1960s and 70s, but began experiencing difficulties in the 1980s. Persistent flooding, unexplained cold spots, electrical malfunctions. Employees refused to work certain areas after hours because of unsettling feelings and a sense of being watched. The shopping center closed in 1997, was demolished in 2003, and the land remains vacant, too troubled by legal complications to develop. Local residents still sometimes speak, usually quietly, and only to those they trust, about the patch of woods near where the old well used to be, woods that somehow survived all development attempts. They say that on certain nights, particularly in early spring and mid-October, you can hear sounds coming from those woods, sounds that might be wind or footsteps or voices raised in argument. They say that sometimes in the early morning fog you can see 3 figures standing at the edge of those woods, one tall like Edmund, one slight like Catherine, one stooped like Josiah in his final years, simply watching, as though waiting for something that will never come. These stories are dismissed as folklore, as inevitable mythology around dramatic historical events, and perhaps that's all they are, stories that help us process the moral complexities of a time when the line between victim and victimizer was often blurred beyond recognition. Or perhaps they are reminders that some debts outlast the people who incurred them, that some crimes echo across generations, and that the past, no matter how deeply buried, never truly stays silent. Perhaps they are warnings that the foundations we build our lives upon matter, that the means by which we achieve success cannot be divorced from the ends we reach, and that every choice creates obligations that must eventually be satisfied. Josiah rose from slavery to become one of the wealthiest black men in the Post, or South, through intelligence, patience, and possibly through 2 murders that went unpunished. He died wealthy but alone, successful but tormented, free but imprisoned by guilt. His fortune was distributed to causes he hoped might balance the moral ledger, but no one remembers his name today except as a footnote in obscure historical texts, a cautionary tale about the costs of ambition pursued without regard for conscience. This mystery reveals the dark complexities of ambition, survival, and justice in a society built on profound injustice, and raises the question of whether true escape from our sins is ever really possible, or whether we carry them with us always, growing heavier until they finally drag us down to where we've always belonged. What do you think happened in those final years? Did Josiah truly commit murder? Or was he destroyed by his own guilt over actions he never took? Was he haunted by genuine supernatural forces or by the far more terrible ghosts of his own conscience? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, subscribe to and hit that notification bell and share this video with anyone who appreciates the darker corners of American history. Until next time, remember that the past is never as distant as we like to believe, and that some stories refuse to stay buried, no matter how much earth we pile on top of them.